Hey Theologian, I just wanted to point out real quick before we get going here that this video is currently playing on my main channel, Bible Unbound. However, this video really lives. It exists on my second channel, Theology Unbound. So that's why it's a little different. If you like this video and you want to see more content like this, I would encourage you to go and subscribe to Theology Unbound and turn notifications on. That's because I won't always be posting the Theology Unbound videos over here on Bible Unbound. Until then, let's explore. I wanted to invite you in on this story today because perhaps you're one of the thousands of individuals who have become so disillusioned by the American evangelical system that you've left entirely.
I'm an ex-evangelical.
Possibly even embittered, unable to see how such a faith could ever be good. Or perhaps you are an evangelical who doesn't realize that there is an entire historical context that you find yourself in. It seems to me that either way, not many people have taken the time to carefully consider the faith that they have spent their entire lives professing. Not many people have taken the time to consider the background of the church they may be sitting in right now, even though it has informed every aspect of their faith. So, this video will lead you on a journey through the American past in an unfiltered and honest look at the history of American evangelicalism. But to just slap a label on every point of doctrine and call it bad is to completely misunderstand how the sovereignty of God works. This is the good news of the American Evangelical Church. Let's explore. Now, this video draws from a variety of sources, all of which are linked in the description below. But the main source, the backbone, is Douglas A. Sweeney's The American Evangelical Story, and I recommend it to anyone wanting to learn more about the history of the American Evangelical Church. The history of American evangelicalism, like America itself, is varied and complex. We encounter our very first problem when asked to define what an American evangelical even is. Well, it seems that no scholar lands on a single definition. Douglas A. Sweeney, in his book The American Evangelical Story, says this: modern evangelicals differ from other Christian groups in that the movement emerged from a definite 18th century cultural context. In other words, he goes on to say, modern evangelicals, as distinguished from others who use the label or share that view of the gospel message, are heirs of the Great Awakening. For those who, like me, may not remember high school American history, the Great Awakening was a period from about 1730 to 1755, where a boom in Christianity, religious zeal, and piety swept across America, seemingly driven by some divine, miraculous force. However, as we will come to see, the first Great Awakening differed significantly from those that will come after it. And plus, by popular understanding, we may see more parallels between American evangelicalism and the Second Great Awakening. To that end, I would argue that we need to define American evangelicalism as a movement with significant cultural and theological ties to America's Second Great Awakening. Let's start from the beginning, though. It's October 29th, 1727, and a rumble begins to move throughout New England. No, not a spiritual rumble. A literal physical earthquake is actually shaking the foundations of people's homes. This unusual seismic event caused many to begin pondering the meaning of life and what may happen after death, as usually happens. Suddenly, people begin showing up in churches all over the northern colonies. Churches like the Second Northampton Meeting House, where Puritan minister Jonathan Edwards could be found giving a sermon. In fact, following one particular sermon late in 1733 about the Sabbath, the entire town of Northampton nearly shut down because of intense and zealous prayers that began filling the hearts and minds of New Englanders. Little did Edwards know at the time, But the same movement of God was happening all around New England. Thus, the First Great Awakening began. The movement, led by Edwards, was a movement wherein piety, or righteous living, was highlighted. This is because of Edwards' intense Calvinistic background. In fact, Edwards characterized this revival in many ways himself. Besides being a deeply Calvinist movement, Edwards relied nearly entirely on God's providence to shape the movement. He was also deeply academic, as were most Puritans, and he was constantly preaching on the subject of God's grace. These were also all defining characteristics of the movement itself. Calvinistic, academic, centered on God's grace. It led to an outburst of theological print. In fact, more ink was spilled by theologians during the First Great Awakening, writing both published work and letters, than any other time in Christian history. This also led to a zealous desire for preachers to evangelize as itinerant ministers. Famous among these itinerant evangelizers was Francis Asbury. Asbury was a Methodist preacher, and he invented something among his Methodist contemporaries called circuit riding. Circuit riders were itinerant preachers who would ride for many hundreds of miles at a time, often without food or water, in order to preach the gospel. In fact, Asbury traveled non-stop for nearly 45 years, covering 300,000 miles on horseback, crossing the Appalachian Mountains more than 60 times, and in the process, preaching 16,000 sermons and ordaining 4,000 Methodist preachers. He had no home, literally, and he once told an English friend to address all future letters to him in America. However, this revival was markedly different than all of the ones that will come after it. And that's because by the end of the 1750s, until the start of about the 1790s, there's an oft-forgotten piece of American history that occurred. The Revolutionary War. America gained independence from Britain and became a freshly minted democracy. Consequently, this had implications for the American religious landscape that can still be felt today. You see, like all religions, American Protestantism began to take on aspects of its culture. And that is why the democratic nature of the American political system forever changed American Christianity. For the sake of clarity, by the way, I'm going to be defining democracy as a populist system in which ordinary people have a voice. Now, America's government was not necessarily structured this way. However, Andrew Jackson in 1829 changed everything with Jacksonian democracy. He popularized the idea that populism was by nature the most virtuous form of government. Because of this and the new national fervor, many churches in America began to model their polity and their methods of evangelism off of this very ideology, namely democracy. This had some serious practical implications, because up until now, Christianity had been a somewhat stiff, academic, ritualistic religion. But to bring the faith down to the quote-unquote common people meant that certain aspects of the First Great Awakening had to be downplayed and other aspects highlighted. Therefore, the lofty academia of Calvinism and Catholicism was rejected in favor of a more experiential Wesleyan Arminian theology. During this time period, aspects of Christianity, like dreams and prophecy, began to become emphasized over rigorous academic study. Public gatherings outside were held, which at the time was unthinkable, so that people who were landlocked, or indeed enslaved, could come to these Christian services. Contemplation, academia, and liturgy began to fade into the background of American Protestantism. And this is where a young preacher named Charles Finney will step onto the stage. Now, there is a significant amount of evidence to suggest that the Second Great Awakening was more or less concocted, primarily by Charles Finney, but also other Protestant evangelists of the time. You see, unlike the First Great Awakening, The second focused its energy on the production and the efficiency of evangelism. The United States, they believed, desperately needed revival, a season of spiritual renewal to fuel the growth of the new nation. A counterpart of counterparts to Edwards, Finney characterized the Second Great Awakening. He designed this production-like church service, often held outdoors and on large stages. To attract more converts, Finney introduced a series of innovations called New Measures, which included the anxious bench, where would-be converts could contemplate their decision for Christ. More than any other historical figure, he made revivals a standard feature of the American religious landscape. Along with the anxious bench, Finney's new measures also included mass advertising practices, long and emotionally intense church meetings, and perhaps most importantly and most influentially, lay leadership. Capturing the essence of American democracy, Finney's meetings became unswayed by Christian orthodoxy in practice, and they included a time where both men, and sometimes even women, could preach from the stage and lead the whole congregation in prayer. This democratization of American theology emphasized a doctrine that is known as biblicism, or biblical literalism, which is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. Since formal theological training was relatively ostracized, the Bible became taken at face value, or in some cases, orthodoxy was rejected entirely in favor of spiritual feelings or inclinations. These were not small meetings either, and they didn't have a little influence. The most famous of these may be the Cane Ridge Tent Revival of 1801, a multi-denominational experience led by a variety of preachers and organized by Finney himself. The Cane Ridge meeting was designed to reach frontier settlers on the edge of Kentucky. It was estimated to have been 12 times larger in population than the largest town in Kentucky at the time. Signs and wonders appeared all around as hundreds of worshipers, slain in the spirit, barked like dogs, jerked uncontrollably, fell into trances, danced, and shouted. These experiences were then taken back to the home churches of the various preachers, many of whom now converted to Finney's style of preaching. This then became the norm for many Methodist, Baptist, and Presbyterian churches of the time. But if you were standing on the stage at Cane Ridge, you would have noticed a deeply unsettling reality that was seldom talked about. Even this tent revival meeting, even with the liberal ideology of Finney, Cane Ridge was segregated. In his autobiography, Reverend Peter Randolph talks about this period in American evangelicalism. The democratic nature of these revival meetings had wide appeal, and oftentimes enslaved peoples would meet secretly in the woods or in cabins late at night to hold these kinds of prayer meetings after experiencing them in some way. Evangelism efforts were also made primarily among Methodist and Baptist preachers, so still today, the largest black churches in America are within these two denominations. As Henry Louis Gates notes in his book, The Black Church, for once, enslaved black Americans felt that they could have a voice and that freedom was possible. Still, emancipation was far off, and it was rarely talked about, and slavery was rarely condemned by white preachers during this time. As Douglas A. Sweeney notes, the true miracle of the Second Great Awakening may be that Christianity spread among the slaves. As Reverend Peter Randolph says of slave meetings together in secret, if discovered, they escaped, if possible. But those who were caught often got whipped. Some are willing to be punished thus for Jesus' sake. In some places, if the slaves are caught praying to God, they are whipped more than if they had committed a great crime. The slaveholders will allow the slaves to dance, but do not want them to pray to God. Sometimes when a slave, on being whipped, calls upon God, he is forbidden to do so, under threat of having their throat slit or the brains blown out. Oh, reader, this seems very hard, that slaves cannot call on their Maker when the case most needs it. This deep and great persecution led to some of the greatest innovations that American evangelicalism is deeply indebted to. One of these is the formation of a distinctly black church in America. But that came at a great price as well. As Martin Luther King Jr. once pointed out,
I think it is one of the tragedies of our nation, one of the shameful tragedies, that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is one of the most segregated hours, if not the most segregated hours in Christian America.
And another great innovation of this time period was that of the spirituals.
Oh, freedom. Oh.
A sound that most every church in America is today indebted to. Indeed, the history of the Black American church has informed other aspects of American culture in ways that are too varied and even unknown that a whole video could be dedicated to it. But here, it's vital to see how after emancipation, during Reconstruction and Jim Crow, the Black church formed a vital, communal, and political center for many African American communities. But it wasn't until after the American Civil War that American evangelicalism takes on a distinct flavor, as it attempts another revival, rooted in the tent meetings of the Second Great Awakening. This brought about what may be the furthest departure from the original Great Awakening, and that is known as the Holiness movement.
Take this boy into your
In another attempt to see piety become the primary focus of American Christianity, a group of denominations calling themselves the Holiness movement began to pull from Finney's work to stir up a movement of God. They emphasized the Holy Spirit's role in salvation. They distorted classic Armenian teachings to a degree that claimed a person needed to become holy enough in this life so that they could prove that their salvation was genuine. This was called a spirit baptism, or entire sanctification. And when a person began their journey toward this level of holiness, signs of the Spirit needed to accompany it. Signs like speaking in tongues and barking like a dog.
come out. In the name of Jesus of Nazareth, come out of it. There it goes, David. It's coming out. Thank you, Lord. Thank you, Jesus.
This formed a deeply pragmatic theology that has later come to be known as moralism. Simply put, moralism is a theological view that sees the Christian life as primarily about morality and the steps necessary to achieve a high moral standing among yourselves, but also your peers. Radical holiness groups then began to distinguish themselves from the movement as they advocated for a return to the original first century church. This would become known as the Pentecostal tradition. It focused on a theology dedicated to returning to the original Pentecost experiences in Acts 2 and began to further separate itself from the holiness movement. However, it was during this time that women were given a much higher place of prominence, allowed to preach, teach, and lead these revival meetings. So it may not surprise you to learn that this generated a zealous evangelism effort largely led by women. But the theology of Pentecostalism was further popularized by an ambiguous and hard-to-define group come to be known as charismatics. Today, it's likely that Christianity all over the world has been influenced by this very tradition in some way. The holiness movement carried on through to World War II, and like the revivals that came before it, it was lost and then reshaped due to the war. However, around the 1960s, a new movement began that attempted to amalgamate the intentional practices of the Second Great Awakening and the holiness movements, largely based on Finney's new measures, but with an added emphasis on the miracles and the works of the Holy Spirit. It also brought with it many of the Calvinist roots from the First Great Awakening, focusing on God's grace and relying less on production and more on a movement of God. The Jesus movement began. This was an era marked by converts to Christianity making a public declaration of faith to follow Jesus, known as decisionism. This then developed a theology around what is called having a personal relationship with Jesus, previously unheard of. It meant that your faith had nothing to do with your parents, your culture, or your socioeconomic status. This movement carried with it some of the most influentials of the 20th century, including Martin Luther King Jr. and Billy Graham. Today, American evangelicalism can be seen as a combination of aspects throughout its history. However, if I were to summarize the theological stance of popular evangelicalism succinctly, I may do it this way, by contrast. It stands apart from Catholic Orthodox sacramental theology, and it more or less rejects the Catholic evangelical theology of Calvinism. and it has come to adopt a moralistic evangelical stand on most theological issues because of its strong democratic biblicism. Now, I just want to be very clear here that I have attached no moral imperatives to the concepts throughout this video, and that was very intentional. I don't know your background or how you relate to this history, but to see the American Evangelical Church as some sort of scourge on American society is to miss entirely how God providentially works through history. I mean, in God's word, he says that he will unite all things in heaven and on earth under his Son, Jesus Christ. And with the American Evangelical Church and its history, he is doing just that to some of the most powerless people groups in American history. Plus, as God often does, he's doing more. He is giving his church a voice. And so, ironically, if you disagree with any part of this video, you're really agreeing with it because you, as a layperson, I imagine, believes that you have the voice to decide what is good theology and what is bad theology. And that is exactly what the Second Great Awakening encouraged American evangelicalism to do. And that is exactly the impact that American evangelicalism has had on Christianity as a whole. Without the revivals of the American past, all people groups around the world would experience a deep and profound sense of loss, both in religious life and in culture. And at that, we can only declare that it is good news. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time. Hey, Austin here. Just a quick reminder about Bible Unbound and the content you just watched, which was supported by our funders over on patreon.com. Patreon is where you try to get a bunch of people to donate small amounts to fund a mission. And the mission of Bible Unbound is to discover the Bible by uncovering the gospel. You see, we are passionate about creating a community of people who want to see Bible-curious people understand the Bible by seeing the gospel and Jesus proclaimed throughout the entire thing. And so if you want to fund that mission, if you want to become a part of the vision we have over here at Bible Unbound, you can explore more of that over on patreon.com. We'd love to see you there. Thanks so much.